It was 11:42 a.m. on May 1st, 1943, over Brest, France. The sky a slaughterhouse. 15 Focke-Wulf 19. O fighters tore through the 8th Air Force's B-17 formation, picking off the flying fortresses with ruthless precision. For the young American airmen, survival was a losing bet. The average B-17 crew had just a 50% chance of finishing their 25 mission tour, and some bomb groups lost that many men in a single month. Their target, Saint-Nazaire's submarine pens, was dubbed Flax City for how bombers fell like cut flax. That morning, 78 fortresses left England. Only 29 hit their mark, 7 never returned, and 75 Americans would be KIA or MIA by sunset. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was supposed to be one of them. A 31-year-old ball turret gunner with 0 combat missions, he'd spent 6 weeks labeled the worst airman in the 306th Bomb Group, stuck with the nickname Snuffy. After the lazy, scheming comic strip hillbilly, it fit perfectly. In an army of 20-year-olds, Smith resented taking orders from younger men, and his enlistment was no act of patriotism. A Michigan judge gave him a choice: jail for unpaid child support or the military. He chose the uniform, never the soldier's life. At Thurley Airfield, his infamy was legendary. He slept through briefings, argued with every officer, lectured airmen on philosophy until they left, and his personnel file bulged with disciplinary infractions. The 423rd Bombardment Squadron's unspoken rule: nobody flew with Snuffy. Pilots requested he never be assigned to their planes. Crews took any replacement but him for the ball turret. The ball turret was the B-17's worst post, a tiny plexiglass in steel sphere slung under the fuselage, barely big enough for a small man to curl into, armed with 2.50 caliber machine guns, just inches of metal and glass separating the gunner from 30,000 feet of empty air. Physically, Smith was perfect, 5 feet 4 inches compact, but in every other way, a liability. The men who trusted their lives to crewmates did not trust him. On that May morning, a crew was short a gunner. No replacements left. For the first time in 6 weeks, Snuffy climbed into a B-17. Its pilot, Captain Lewis Johnson, was a veteran on his 25th and final mission. One more flight, and he'd be home, safe after surviving the military's deadliest assignment. Smith, by contrast, had never seen combat. He'd trained on fixed targets, memorized rules, but never watched a German fighter dive with cannons blazing, never seen a B-17 explode, never smelled burning flesh at 25,000 feet. He'd learn it all in one afternoon, and no one at Thurley thought he'd make it back. On the return to England, the navigator made a fatal mistake. He mistook Brittany for England's southern coast. Johnson descended through the clouds, convinced they were minutes from home, and broke through at 2,000 feet, directly over fortified Brest. Anti-aircraft guns fired instantly. The Focke-Wulfs returned, 15 to 20 of them, their cannon shells slamming into the B-17, shaking it to its core. The left fuel tank ruptured, aviation gasoline gushing into the radio compartment and igniting in a fireball. The oxygen system exploded, and 3 crewmen bailed out at once, choosing a parachute's uncertainty over burning to death. Tail gunner Sergeant Roy Gibson was hit by shrapnel, trapped in the rear, unable to move through the flames. The plane's waist was an inferno, and every instinct screamed at Smith to jump. This was what everyone expected. Snuffy, the useless troublemaker, would cut and run. A burning bomber at 2,000 feet gave a crew 90 seconds to evacuate before structural failure. Parachutes worked. Staying meant death. The radio operator and 2 waist gunners had made that choice, and none would survive the day. Smith stared at the flames, the open emergency exit, the empty sky. Then he did the unthinkable. He turned from the exit and moved toward the fire. The B-17's waist was 14 feet long, 6 feet wide, cramped even on quiet missions, with 2 waist gunners at open windows, a radio compartment forward, a tail aft, a narrow crawlway to the turret. That day it was a living hell. Aviation gasoline burns at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When the tank ruptured, fuel sprayed across equipment, ammo boxes, and thin aluminum, the fire spreading in seconds, flames climbing walls, toxic smoke choking the space, temperatures rising fast enough to melt skin. Smith had no real firefighting gear. The B-17's small extinguishers were for electrical fires, useless against fuel. The manual's rule for an uncontrollable fire: abandon ship. Every airman knew it, but Smith ignored it. He grabbed a wool blanket and beat the flames until it caught fire. Then a canvas scrap. Same result. The fire was too hot, too fast. Then the ammo started cooking off. Rows of .50 caliber rounds in metal boxes along the walls ignited as temperatures rose, bullets firing randomly, ricocheting off the plane's interior. Smith fought a fire while live ammo exploded around him, shrapnel flying. Any other airman would have bailed, but Snuffy made a rule-breaking choice. The exploding ammo was fueling chaos, so he picked up the red-hot boxes with his bare hands. The metal seared his flesh, blistering his palms, cracking skin until blood dripped. But he didn't stop. He carried each box to the waste windows and threw it out, his hands burning more with every trip. Between runs, he fought the fire and found the only liquid available: the relief tube, where the crew urinated to vent outside. He disconnected it and doused the flames, then used the tiny fire extinguisher, useless as it was, then urinated directly on the burning metal, doing anything to keep flames from Gibson and the oxygen tanks that would blow the plane apart. The Focke-Wulfs weren't done. German pilots saw the smoke trailing the crippled B-17, an easy kill, and made repeated attack runs, cannon shells punching more holes in the aluminum, adding new fires. Each pass forced Smith to abandon firefighting and man the waist gun, a weapon he'd never fired at a live target. Now he swung the heavy .50 caliber at fighters diving at 300 miles per hour, squeezing the trigger in short bursts, his burned hands screaming in pain, trying to fill the sky with lead to ward off attacks. Then back to the fire, then the gun, then the fire, an endless cycle. For 90 minutes, Maynard Smith waged a one-man war: firefighter, gunner, rescuer. The man called worthless was the only thing standing between 6 surviving crewmen and certain death. Johnson fought to keep the B-17 airborne, wrestling with damaged controls, vital cables severed, the plane threatening to dive or roll apart. He coaxed every mile out of the dying machine, his only goal: reach England, land before the fuselage burned through. Behind him, Smith was winning. The fire faded, the ammo was gone, Gibson was alive. But the English coast was still miles away, and the B-17 held together by little more than faith and scrap aluminum. Below them, the English Channel, a gray, cold expanse where downed crews had just 4 minutes before hypothermia set in, where hundreds of Americans had drowned in 1943. Johnson watched fuel gauges plummet. The ruptured tank had lost most of their reserve, and what was left barely enough to reach the coast. It would take a miracle, and Smith had already made one. The English Channel stretched gray and choppy below, wind howling against the B-17's battered fuselage, its skin pockmarked with thousands of bullet, cannon, and shrapnel holes, wings straining, engines sputtering as fuel dwindled. Captain Johnson's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, eyes fixed on the horizon for England's coast. Behind him, in the smoke-stained waste, Maynard Smith finally caught his breath, burned hands throbbing, flight suit singed with soot and blood, lungs burning from 90 minutes of toxic fumes. He'd beaten the fire, but the war wasn't over. The Focke-Wulfs had turned back at France, unwilling to face British Spitfires over open water. But the B-17 was still dying. One mistake, and they'd all sink into the channel. Smith crawled low to the tail section, avoiding the worst smoke, and found Roy Gibson conscious, legs and torso torn by shrapnel, face ashen with pain. Gibson had been trapped for over an hour, listening to the fire, exploding ammo, and wind screaming through the plane, convinced he'd burn alive. Smith fumbled through the emergency first aid kit with his burned fingers, dressing Gibson's wounds, pressing on bleeding gashes, talking in a calm, steady voice, a side of him no one had seen. He propped Gibson against a metal bulkhead, then crawled back to the waist, grabbed the gun, and stood watch. No German fighters came. For the first time that day, the sky was quiet. An hour later, Cornwall's coast emerged from the haze. A faint green line and a hoarse cheer rose from the crew. Johnson knew they'd never make it 200 miles back to Thurley. The B-17 would fall from the sky first. He spotted RAF Predenac, a grass airfield on England's southwest tip. Built for coastal fighters, its runway short for a B-17, facilities minimal. But it was flat, close, their only chance. Johnson lined up the approach, lowered the landing gear, and 3 green lights confirmed the wheels were locked. He cut power, and the battered fortress sank to the grass strip, touching down smooth and steady. No skid, no crash. For a heartbeat, the ordeal was over. The crew sighed in relief. Smith slumped against the gun, unable to believe they'd survived. Johnson, a 25-mission veteran, had landed a dying B-17 on a short grass runway. His final mission, a success. But the fire had done unseeable damage. The radio compartment's aluminum, seared for 90 minutes at 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, had lost all structural integrity. The landing's stress, the plane's weight on its wheels, was too much. A sickening crack split the air. The B-17 broke in half behind the wing root. The nose slid forward, the tail ground to a halt, the crew thrown forward by the force. Rescue crews sprinted to the wreckage, expecting charred bodies. What they found was Maynard Smith climbing out of the shattered tail, burned hands wrapped in a tattered cloth, then turning back to lift Gibson over twisted metal, supporting his weight as they stumbled to safety. It was an unforgettable sight. The man everyone called useless, carrying a wounded comrade from a bomber that should have been ash. Ground crews counted the damage later. 3,500 penetrations from bullets, cannon, and shrapnel. More than any B-17 they'd ever seen. The plane staying airborne to reach England defied all engineering logic. That evening, Johnson wrote his mission report. His assessment of Smith unequivocal. The ball turret gunner's actions alone saved the aircraft, and every surviving crewman he recommended Smith for the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, awarded only for valor far beyond the call of duty. The recommendation raced up the chain of command, and days later, a Stars and Stripes correspondent arrived at Thurley to interview the unlikely hero. Andy Rooney, a 23-year-old journalist who'd become a famous broadcaster, found Smith in the barracks. Still the sergeant with burned hands, a thick disciplinary file, and a reputation as the squadron's worst airman. Rooney listened, took notes, and wrote an article that made Smith famous across 2 continents. The misfit who saved his crew. The story hit newspapers weeks after the 8th Air Force needed it most. The European bombing campaign was costing thousands of American lives. Home front morale was low, and the military craved heroes. Stories that gave families hope, that proved courage lived in the unlikeliest men. Smith was that hero, a 31-year-old ex-con, a military hater, a zero-combat gunner who'd fought a fire for 90 minutes with his bare hands, saved 6 lives and brought a crippled B-17 home. The Army's PR machine sprang into action. Photographers captured Smith posing with B-17s, demonstrating the ball turret, standing with officers who'd barely spoken to him weeks before. His face, burned hands bandaged, appeared in newspapers across America, and mothers across the country felt hope their sons might survive. Radio programs retold his story, amplifying the drama. The man nobody wanted, the first combat mission, the bomber that broke in half. Smith's fame exploded. He received thousands of letters, marriage proposals, autograph requests, congratulations from WWII veterans. Thurley's postal clerks had never processed so much mail for one enlisted man. He went from the 306th most hated airman to the European theater's most famous in days. But fame curdled for Smith. The 423rd's men watched his rise with awe and resentment. No one disputed his heroism. His actions had been impossible, courageous. But combat bravery didn't change the man. Smith was still difficult, argumentative, convinced his age and smarts entitled him to special treatment. He still slept through briefings, lectured airmen until they left, clashed with officers. The only difference, a Medal of Honor recommendation backed his arrogance, making him untouchable. The attention went to his head at once. Smith signed autographs, Sergeant Maynard Smith, CMH, the Congressional Medal of Honor he hadn't earned yet. He retold the May 1st story to anyone who'd listen, And with each telling, it grew. His role expanded, details shifted. A desperate survival fight became an epic where he was the sole hero. Crewmen noticed the lies first. Small inconsistencies, then big fabrications. Smith describing actions he never took, conversations he never had. The core truth remained. He fought the fire, saved the crew, but the rest was fiction. This was Smith's paradox. A genuine hero who couldn't stop embellishing his heroism. A man who earned respect, then squandered it with vanity. The squadron tolerated him. Criticizing a soon-to-be Medal of Honor recipient would reflect poorly on the entire unit. General Ira Eaker, 8th Air Force commander, reviewed the recommendation personally. The evidence was overwhelming. Johnson's report, crew witness statements, the B-17's shattered frame. Eaker approved it, sending it to Washington, where the War Department concurred. The medal was authorized, a ceremony scheduled. For the first time in American military aviation history, an enlisted airman would receive the Medal of Honor in the European theater. July 15, 1943 was set for the ceremony, and the 8th Air Force spared no expense. Secretary of War Henry Stimson would travel to England to present the medal to Smith, a historic moment, immortalized in photos and newsreels, a boost for the war effort. The Army planned everything: a B-17 formation flying overhead, a ceremonial platform at Thurley, press in attendance. Every detail was coordinated for maximum positive coverage. But in the chaos, one thing was forgotten. No one told Maynard Smith the date of his own ceremony. PR officers assumed squadron officers had notified him. Squadron officers assumed the PR team had it covered. Smith fell through the cracks, and on July 15th, he was nowhere to be found. Stimson stood at the podium on Thurley's tarmac, the Medal of Honor in his hand, as B-17S circled overhead, burning precious fuel. Dignitaries, generals, and journalists waited in silence, cameras rolling. A search party fanned out, checking barracks, the officers' club, every building, no Smith. Minutes turned to hours, and the search grew desperate. Someone finally checked the mess hall and found him. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, the hero of May 1st, scraping leftover food from trays into garbage bins. He'd been assigned to KP duty, punishment for his latest disciplinary infraction. Another argument with an officer, another refusal to follow orders. The officer who found him said nothing for the record. The moment was too absurd, too humiliating. Smith was rushed to the ceremony, still in his stained KP uniform. Grease on his sleeves, hands dirty from washing dishes. He barely wiped his face before Stimson placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, the blue ribbon and gold medal glinting in the sun. Newsreels captured it all: the disheveled hero, the solemn secretary, the circling B-17S. The Army's PR machine edited the story. No mention of KP duty, just the historic medal presentation. But the men at Thurley knew the truth, and the tale spread through the 8th Air Force in hours. Snuffy Smith, the hero who missed his own Medal of Honor ceremony for kitchen duty. For years, veterans told it as proof. Courage and character are not the same. Smith flew 4 more combat missions after the ceremony, climbing back into the ball turret each time, scanning the skies for German fighters, waiting for flak. He'd proven he was a hero, but heroism didn't erase fear. The terror of combat, bombers exploding, cannon shells slamming into the fuselage, gnawed at his mind, his nerves. The 5th mission was his last. The psychological toll was too much. He suffered crippling nightmares, unrelenting anxiety, hypervigilance, and inability to concentrate. Today, it's PTSD. In 1943, it was operational exhaustion. The doctors grounded him permanently. The Medal of Honor recipient who saved 6 lives over Brest spent the rest of the war behind a desk, processing paperwork far from the sky that made him a hero and broke him. Smith hated desk duty. He'd grown used to fame, interviews, and photos. The monotony of endless forms was a bitter pill. Journalists still wanted to talk to him, but his co-workers were tired of his exaggerations, his lies, his arrogance, and arguments. His disciplinary problems worsened. Official records show repeated clashes with superiors, failed duties, a total inability to follow military structure. The same traits that made him an outcast before May 1st remained. The medal made him famous, not a better soldier. By December 1944, the Army had run out of patience. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, Medal of Honor holder, was demoted to private, the first and only recipient in American history stripped of rank while on active duty. The Army hid the demotion. The contrast between the newspaper hero and the problematic soldier was too damaging to the war effort. Smith was permanently grounded, his flying days over. In February 1945, with 4 months left in the European War, the Army sent him home to Michigan, back to the life he'd left, back to the man he'd been before May 1st. His hometown of Cairo threw him a parade. Citizens lined the streets, waving flags, cheering for the local boy who'd earned the Medal of Honor. None knew about the demotion, the KP duty, the lies, the endless infractions. They knew only the newspaper story. The misfit turned hero. For one afternoon, Smith was everything the Army wanted. A symbol, an inspiration, proof ordinary Americans could be heroes. He stood in an open car, waving, the medal around his neck, and for a moment he was proud. Then the parade ended, the crowds left, and Smith was alone, facing a post-war life he had no idea how to live. Germany surrendered in May 1945, ending the European War. The 8th Air Force's bombing campaign had dropped 600,000 tons of bombs, cost 26,000 American lives, with 28,000 more captured or missing. The costliest air operation in military history. Smith had contributed 90 minutes to it, one mission, one burning plane, one afternoon of extraordinary courage, followed by months of failure. He was discharged on May 26th, 34 years old, a former private with a Medal of Honor, no plan for civilian life. The post-war transition was brutal. Smith had never held a job long before the war, and his personality hadn't changed. Argumentative, opinionated, convinced he was better than everyone. He cycled through jobs, tax work, clerical labor, manual jobs, nothing lasting more than a few months. He'd clash with a supervisor, then quit or be fired. The Medal of Honor opened doors, but his behavior closed them. Employers who hired a war hero found a difficult employee who couldn't follow orders. His personal life was just as broken. Smith married twice more after the war. Both marriages ended in divorce. Women were drawn to the heroic story, not the complicated man behind it. The man who couldn't hold a job, who argued constantly, who was still haunted by 90 minutes over Brest. Child support debts mounted, legal troubles followed. By the early 1950s, Smith was what he'd always been, a man who couldn't make his life work. The medal sat in a drawer, newspaper clippings yellowed in scrapbooks, his fame fading into the ordinary struggles of middle-class America. He was not alone. Thousands of WWII veterans returned home with medals and combat trauma. No way to process their pain, no support for their wounds, no way to turn combat skills into civilian jobs. The generation that saved the world found heroism didn't pay the mortgage, that the shooting stopped, but the nightmares didn't. The VA tried to help, but resources were limited. PTSD poorly understood. Veterans who jumped at loud noises, who couldn't sleep, who couldn't connect with their families were told to adjust. Many couldn't, Smith included. He coped by talking about the war nonstop, retelling the May 1st story to anyone who'd listen, and many who wouldn't. Each telling added more fiction. By the 1970s, he claimed he'd flown the damaged B-17 back to England, a feat done by another airman on another mission. Veterans who knew the truth said nothing. Military brotherhood protected even difficult men. The medal represented something bigger than the Smith's mistakes. To attack him was to attack every man who served over Europe. Historians resented the lies. The real story was remarkable enough. No embellishment needed. But Smith couldn't stop. Those 90 minutes over Brest were the high point of his life. Everything before was failure. Everything after struggle. He clung to the story because it was the only proof he'd ever been great. The years passed, Smith aging, his body breaking down from that day in the sky. His burned hands developed arthritis, his lungs weakened by toxic smoke, his heart strained by hard living. The 306 veterans held reunions, sharing memories of missions and loss. Smith attended a few, tolerated, not welcomed. The men remembered both the troublemaker and the hero, the two versions clashing uncomfortably. In 1979, he gave his final major interview to Sergeant's Magazine, his story the most fictional yet, and no one corrected him. He was 68, the medal still on his ribbon, and the core truth remained. He'd been a hero once. That had to be enough. Maynard Harrison Smith died on May 11, 1984, in St. Petersburg, Florida, at 72, heart failure the cause. He'd outlived most of the men who'd flown with him, most who'd refused to fly with him. The Army honored his passing, despite their complicated history. Medal of Honor recipients get buried at Arlington National Cemetery, no matter their service record. The demotion, the KP duty, the infractions, none of it mattered. Only the medal did. He was laid to rest among Arlington's white headstones, beside generals and privates, heroes and ordinary soldiers. Death erased the lines that had divided him in life. His grave marker is simple: name, rank, service dates, Medal of Honor. No mention of kitchen duty, lies, or failed marriages. Just the essentials. He served, he was honored, he rests here. The Medal of Honor has been awarded 3,500 times in American history, each for valor so extraordinary it stands apart from the millions of brave moments in war. The standard is extreme, reserved for those who risk everything beyond duty. Smith met that standard on May 1, 1943. Whatever came after, whatever failures he had, those 90 minutes over Brest satisfied the military's strictest criteria. He was one man against fire, fighters, and certain death. He chose to stay when everyone else left. He saved lives that would have been lost. That fact defines his legacy. The 306th Bomb Group completed 342 combat missions, dropping 22,000 tons of bombs on Europe, losing 171 aircraft. The men of Thurley paid a price in thousands of lives, each a family receiving a telegram no one wanted to read. The group became one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced, flying the deadliest early missions with no fighter escort, adapting and surviving until the war ended. Smith's story is part of that history. The 306th archives record him exactly as he was. A difficult man who did an extraordinary thing, a hero who couldn't escape his own flaws. The National Museum of the mighty 8th Air Force in Georgia preserves the campaign's history with a restored B-17 and its ball turret, a glass and steel egg under the fuselage, a reminder of the cramped, dangerous post Smith occupied. Guides explain how he cranked himself out of the powerless turret over Brest and climbed into the burning plane, a detail that captures 1943 aerial combat. Technology failed constantly. Survival depended on human improvisation, on men who refused to quit. Thurley Airfield still exists, runways repurposed, buildings demolished, but the land remembers. Markers note it as a former American bomber base, and U.S. visitors make pilgrimages there, standing where their fathers and grandfathers stood, where Maynard Smith stood, the worst airman in the squadron and its greatest hero. England's countryside absorbed endless American blood in World War II. Young men flying over green fields to Germany, many never returning, the ones who did carrying memories that lasted a lifetime. The question remains how to remember Maynard Smith. We want heroes to be perfect, brave in combat, good in life, admirable in every way. But Smith refused to fit that mold. He was difficult before the war, during it, after it, heroic for 90 minutes, problematic for 72 years. He earned America's highest honor and its deepest frustration in equal measure. But that complexity is his honest legacy. Heroism is not perfection. It is not likability. It is the willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of fear, regardless of odds, regardless of who you were before or who you'll be after. It is choosing to save lives when everyone else runs. Maynard Smith was a flawed man who did a perfect thing. That is enough. That is how we remember him.